Aye. Against?
Aye.
Carried. Thank you. Right, now we go to item 11, which is exploring alternate funding and financing opportunities, which is something that we should have agreed that we should always do. And now we have a wonderful approach to that, and I welcome to the table Nancy, Michael and Fiona. Welcome. Who's going to lead off?
So, kia ora all. Just to introduce, with me today, I've got Fiona from our Development Program Office, who we're working really closely with in this project, and Nancy Liu from my team. Just like to introduce her, and she'll be presenting the report today.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. This report seeks your support for our continuous exploration of opportunities to accelerate investment in growth infrastructure, particularly on the use of the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act. Auckland Council's 10-year budget agreed on the 25th of May provides infrastructure investment to support housing and urban development in key growth areas. However, it also notes from our work done on the housing growth infrastructure lane of the budget that a council cannot afford to fund all of the infrastructure required to achieve the desired levels of growth. Although our other funding mechanisms such as the developer mitigation and development contributions can fund the infrastructure to some extent, it is apparent that there is a significant funding and financing gap that will lead to delays in delivering infrastructure to meet the growth demands in housing and employment in Auckland. So given the Council's current capital and operating constraints, staff have been exploring alternative funding and financing options, especially on the opportunities that the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act 2020 may potentially provide as a new tool in the funding toolbox. This Act itself is complex and new, so we are working closely with the several government departments as a working group, including the Crown Infrastructure Partners, Treasury, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. We believe it is better to involve the various government departments early on, and it is especially beneficial for the initial works and pilot projects. As a working group, we work closely to better understand the interpretation of this Act, the selection of potential projects, the review and analysis of these projects, and to finally recommend a pilot project for you to review and decision-making. Under this Act, special purpose vehicles could be created for each funded project to raise finance for the infrastructure through collection of multi-year levies to repay the finance raised. The levy amount, term, payer, and what we called as project beneficiaries would be presented and eventually agreed by Cabinet. On completion of the project, these assets will be vested in the Council. We know that there are several projects that can be funded through the mechanism prescribed by the Act. We have commenced the detailed analysis work, and later in the year we will report to the committee with a number of options for the pilot scheme and a recommendation at the appropriate times. This work will enable us to have a process in place, working with the Crown for an infrastructure funding and financing application that the councillors will endorse to support growth. While we focus on investigating funding opportunities through the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, we will not disregard other opportunities in the meantime. We will continue to assess individual initiatives with the oversight from senior management and steering groups, and would then be presented to and considered by you before we undertake substantial work for a formal proposal. As the use of the infrastructure funding and financing tool is only one tool in the finance toolbox, we will also consider other options, such as using additional debt within the 290% limit, or even debt beyond our agreed limits, or sale of assets, or additional revenue streams through higher rates or development contributions. So we have presented today seeking your support to our continuous exploration of opportunities, particularly on the using of the Act to enable growth infrastructure. We will continue to work with multiple partners on various projects and in different locations, and we will present to you on our analysis and proposal in due course. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. My first question comes from Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for not being able to be there in person today, and thank you for the opportunity to Skype in. I have two questions. One of them is around the work that's being done at the moment with the working group. I was thinking about the opportunity for governors to be not involved in the working group, but to be carried along that journey for future direction setting and decision making on growth and on funding growth. When you have an opportunity to understand how these decisions or what has happened along the way, sometimes it makes decision making a lot more efficient. So are there any governors, councillors I mean, at the moment involved in that piece of work?
So through the chair, this working group sits underneath the joint work program on housing and growth, which we have with central government. And sitting on that party are the mayor and deputy mayor and I think the chair of planning. And so that's the governance oversight of this work program. And additionally, as Nancy mentioned, we'll be coming back to you with any options that are generated and reporting back through this body for any further decisions.
Thank you. So the answer would be just to request a briefing if we wanted more information.
Yeah,
Yes,
and that would be okay. Great.
Thank you. My second question, Chair, is around the plan changes for Drury, and I don't know if you can answer this question. What influence does the fact that there won't be anything in terms of a funding model through the IFF when those plan changes are being heard to compromise the future growth or to compromise the outcome of the decision by the commissioners on the plan changes?
Through the chair. Difficult to say because it's a situation that requires us to wait and see how other people interpret legislation. We are presenting evidence in plan changes around our funding status and with regard to what infrastructure is available there. But it's really hard to answer that question. There's a lot of variables and not really, I wouldn't want to preempt how it is taken into account.
Thank you for your answer.
Just to add to that, I think that what we are saying today here just reconfirms what we've said through many fora over time, including through directly in our LTP, is that we don't currently have the funding and financing to deliver all the infrastructure we know is needed at this time, and that what we are doing is continuing to work to find ways to increase or accelerate that level of investment.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Second question, Councillor Newman.
Good morning, and actually Councillor Dalton's question largely makes my question redundant because I too had a query as to what we are telling the commissioners at the time with respect to the plan changes, noting that we don't have the funding model in place developed for Drury. Also too now the situation Drury is made worse by the recent decisions announced by government around Mill Road. So I'm just wanting to understand, you've identified within the scope of this paper the discussion in Drury and the option for Drury being a pilot for an IFF opportunity, but the scope of the model that you're proposing here, I mean, how far developed is this? Because it just seems to me to be, I can understand the concept, but frankly, the revised scope of what the funding package would need to look like under this opportunity seems to be changing dramatically. It will have to become more and more and more expensive to reflect the infrastructure needs and gaps in that location, which will of course impact in terms of future housing cost, which is fine if that's what's required. But what's the timing for this? Where is that information?
Through the chair, you're correct. It is a changing landscape with regards to the amount of infrastructure funding required. that is why we have put that working group together. The legislation is very broad and wide-reaching, and it allows us to interpret it very widely. It needs some guidance notes as to how Crown wishes us to address and apply through those scenario breaking, and it also, once we've got those scenarios together, it will need some councillor guidance, which is relevant to the question that was asked earlier about if there are opportunities along the way where we need some guidance on your opinions. We will bring it to you. It's not that advanced. We have commenced the process, hence wanting to come back to you towards the end of the year. There's a lot of discussion required with Crown and education around the complexity of the application. Does that answer the question, Chair?
Well, could I ask, is any of this information forming the basis of our planning response to those plan change applications?
So our planning response is to provide evidence of the infrastructure funding and financing position. The exercise that we're going on is to try and find alternative finance to fund the gaps that are identified. Did that answer your question?
It's a question for planning, Chair, but I presume the answer to my question is that we are telling the commissioners that the gaps are massive, that the funding instruments are not in place to address that, and we are trying with some difficulty to try and find a way to figure a way out to try and get through this. In the meantime, we have some real problems with the plan change applications. Would that be fair? Probably not for these people to answer, but I presume that's the answer.
I'll take that as a comment because it's rhetorical potentially, but yes. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, team, for the work. The IFS is an opportunity, but it's not the whole solution. It never can be. Everyone understands that. I want to know how your work has been impacted by the consenting fast-track legislation that's called back to the Minister and ASC Commissioner that does potentially bring us some uncoordinated and out-of-sequence developments. That could be quite a spanner in the works, I would presume, if it goes through and passed.
I suppose the key to the work we're doing is, it's a initially very big picture view of the requirements for the whole area and across multiple different infrastructure types, and seeing if we can solve any pieces of that puzzle using this tool. And as you've identified, it's a new tool, and it's really productive that we're working with Treasury, MHUD, CIP to find a way to use that tool to accelerate our investment, because as you all know through the LTP work, there's only so much investment we can make with current funding models, and so looking to advance it. Details around specific consenting issues and fast track, we haven't got quite into those as yet, but we feel we're making good progress. All right, Deputy Mayor. Progress, I think progress is the word he's looking, not good progress. Councillor Walker.
I've got a couple of questions. We've got this national policy statement on urban development looming. I would expect that will create enhancement in value of the order of billions within those areas. I'm assuming that there's some work being done on estimating what that value uplift is, and I'm assuming that there's some effort around how we might capture some of that, because otherwise that value uplift is lost to us. And yes, it's been driven by government, but we're party to that. As it stands now, we've already lost value uplift through the unitary plan process and through other plan changes. So are we actively looking at that and engaging with government around opportunities?
So through the chair, there's been a lot of work done by officers over value capture opportunities over the years. This particular project is around looking at the IFF tool and how we can use that. And the IFF tool, like DC's, is a cost recovery mechanism rather than necessarily a value capture mechanism. Now, it can be seen to have some of the characteristics of a value capture mechanism, but at its heart, it's a cost recovery tool, and decisions around it need to be made in that light.
Thank you.
Just further to this, these sorts of tools are widely used in other jurisdictions. In France, for example, things are done on a much more voluntary basis. In London, Crossrail and the like, the circumstances is different. It would be really useful for us to be informing ourselves on various tools that might be available. Some of them may be more voluntary, for example, so that we can actually make this stuff happen. Otherwise, my real concern is that value uplift will go to essentially the private sector. The opportunity will be lost. It's immense. So I'm just putting that on the table. The other question I've got just goes to the application of what you're doing to case studies. I clocked in quite a significant amount of effort trying to unlock a location associated with Cooley Ave in Silverdale. I'd put that up as a case study. Here is an instance where you've got an area that's in incredibly close proximity to a bus station, incredibly market attractive, a potential very quickly to produce commercial intensification, but also apartments and the like, of some scale. I just found, trying to work through that, great difficulties working with New Zealand Transport. Some parts of council were more accommodating, but it was very, very difficult generating any kind of integrative approach, trying to tap into some sort of facility that might avail of the development contributions that were going to be arising from that area. And frankly, in terms of infrastructure, quite modest infrastructure requirements, and all of this across a background where there were just 3 property owners. One of them could actually build the infrastructure. So this is a case study where almost all of the planets were in alignment, and we still can't pull anything off. Whether or not the National Policy Statement on Urban Development will go some way to rectifying that, I don't know, but it would be very useful to have a case study approach, and I'd certainly put that up as a location that's incredibly market attractive.
Okay, take that on board.
Sorry, point of order, Chair. Are we in questions and comment or just question?
I think the councillors used the time to have both question and
Okay,
comment.
cool. Just because I'm coming up, so I want to know.
You're next.
If there is a response, it'd be welcome. So I'm asking a question around the possibility of having case studies, because that's one of the best ways to actually...
So this paper talks about us using Drury as a key case study, and it is our key case study. We've got a lot of, paper details a number of reasons why we've used that one, and particularly the high level of engagement from central government is a key factor there. We're not saying no to other opportunities, and we're looking at other ones as they come up, and we can have a look at that particular one and see how it might fit into the scheme.
Thank you. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, paragraph 32. Why aren't we looking at the northwest?
Through the Chair, we are actually doing preparation and investigation work that is going on through the same period before we come back and report again on the case study. The idea of doing the case study where we chose is because it's the most complex environment, probably will cover off most of the things that we need to arrange between questions and decisions for councillors and Crown. and hoping that we will be ready off the back of the Supporting Growth Alliance detailed business cases and all the other information we're gathering in that period to be able to use it as one of the applications or present it to you as an application.
Great, that's really wonderful. I really appreciate that work. I just very briefly urge that we keep in mind the timing of the Northwest and try and get there as quick as we can. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure we're trying to fund actually is already needed by the existing population, never mind the ones that are coming in. And so the timing really is critical. But at the same time, yeah, we need houses wherever we can get them. And I do support Drury to be that case study. So thank you very much. Well done.
Yeah, you're so true. Thank you. Councillor Young.
Yes, with our current financial constraints, I definitely support trying any new tools that may help us unlock funding to get our city moving, as well as infrastructure to supporting the greenfield housing. We also looking with government how we might use this act to deliver bigger transport infrastructure purchase. Like, for example, speeding up the delivery of our rapid transit network. The benefit from the higher density housing growth that this could allow would be high, particularly in light of the recent national policy statement on the urban development. Thank you.
Yes, so the IFF Act, anybody can make an application for any type of infrastructure, including the land element. That was part of the negotiations when we were drafting the Act, is part of the learnings that they took from that. I think we just need to work with Crown to get the first one off the ranks, and then see, we will understand at the end of this exercise how flexible and how much we may want to use this and bring that to the table for you.
Yeah, good answer. That's right. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It might not be for this paper, but I think in general, the issue is the issue that we just shouldn't be building in all these areas because of the issues we have. And I guess the flow and effect, you know, even with these solutions or potential solutions, how do they affect the operating costs? Because for instance, Milldale, yep, few solutions for roads and pipes, but there's no public transport there at all, and there's no public transport planned, and we don't have funding to do that. So I guess my concern is this really, we're trying to put a tool over something that maybe we shouldn't be doing in the first place.
So it's exactly why we're working on this with our colleagues from, not just from DPO, but from across the organisation. What we want to do is bring together some options, come back to you, and then you say, look, to deliver this infrastructure, this is the sort of prices you're looking at. And also at that time, you know, then when we've got actual packages together, we can look at other issues such as ongoing operating costs, such as climate impacts. Those sort of things will be things we'll need to look at, but only once we've actually got some options there. And once we've done that detailed analysis of what the infrastructure requirements are, and what phasings could be, or in order to deliver that infrastructure. So, but it definitely, once, you know, at this stage, what we're saying is we want to go ahead and do that, looking at options. But once they come back to you, then that's when the real prices are clear and the real cost of that infrastructure becomes clear, and that's when other ongoing costs, etc., become real.
Thank you. Councillor Darby. Oh, sorry, did you want to say?
Yes, if I may, through the chair, we are very cognisant of the potential impacts of OPEX, and we have started working with the council group in trying to form what that may look like. So it's not forgotten, and it is an important part of the growth outcomes. I agree with you.
And just brief question. Thank you for those answers. I guess for me, what is being done give us the true cost? Because often we go, look, affordable housing, $600,000 or $700,000, but we've added $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to a person's rate bill as a what are they called? The vehicle that, you know, because we have only collected $25,000 in DCs when we could have collected 125, etc. So yeah, I guess I just want to see the full cost of what we're really showing people. And you know, you might buy a house and say hooray, and then realise that you've got to pay $6,000 or something every year for the rest of your, you know.
Exactly, through the chair. We're very cognisant that it's a jigsaw puzzle of costs. Somebody has to pay. There's only a few ways that we can make it happen. The whole point of the case study is so that we can give you those scenarios for debate and for decision making.
Yeah. Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Just at the outset, I did email on this, probably a question for you, Peter, regarding the Crown Infrastructure Partners approach that we were part of at Milldale. When are we going to see a report as to the status of that and to understand the success or otherwise of that infrastructure and funding financing package?
Shall I carry on? Through the chair, if I may, my team is doing the monitoring with Crown Infrastructure Partners on that, and I can make it a task to bring that to your next meeting if that's what you wish. Tell me how regularly you would like an update.
Well, I think it is critical because we're embarking on another body of work around infrastructure and funding and financing, and we don't know how the last one landed and worked. There's a project list for Milldale, a very clear project list, and there is concern that that project list is not being delivered. So I think we need to reflect on what we've done and understand that, not to necessarily stop progressing this work, but actually we too often make decisions and we don't have, you know, post-event reports or post-implementation reports. And it's pretty fundamental that we need to understand that. So that's a gap for me at the moment. If it is a future report, let's see that. Which takes me to this report, which generally I'm supportive of, and I'll just go to the motion because the motion doesn't really give much direction other than it acknowledges the report, but the report is actually a bit more prescriptive because it narrows down onto Drury. Not disagreeing with that entirely, but if you look at paragraph 19, you're referring to various options, and you talk about Northwest Drury, etc. And then paragraph 31 narrows down onto Drury and other projects, and then it goes on to say with a focus on Drury, and then we have there's further mention there of adopting the recommended approach. But there is no motion, there's no recommendation here to adopt the recommended approach. So I think that needs a bit of a tidy up if there is a recommended approach. But I would suggest, and my question is, Chair, is the recommended approach has a greenfields focus. Now, Councillor Henderson, Councillor Cooper, I'm sure they're concerned about what's already got out of the blocks on Greenfield, which is that northwest deficit. I would probably say on the joint government council housing and growth program, we already know we've got massive deficits in brownfields areas, Tāmaki, Roskill, they're the big ones. So my question is, if we're going to do a pilot on a green in Drury, why can't we also do a pilot at the same time on a brownfields example, say Tāmaki, so that we can get a read and, you know, compare notes on green and brown, at least.
So through the chair, we do continue to do a whole lot of work with government partners on the Auckland Housing Program, and we're meeting with Fiona's team and my team, dealing with them regularly, and trying to find ways through to support and deliver infrastructure quicker in areas such as Tāmaki, such as Mount Albert and Mount Roskill, Mangere and Northcote and Oranga. So looking in those areas, we are doing a lot of work. For this specific tool, what we felt was that
the Drury option was the best option to start looking at how a levy, for example, is charged, and that looking at a greenfield option first was what we thought was the best option. We've got a lot of engagement on IFF for Drury with central government, and so that enables us to get that work done early and at lower cost. And so that's why we've taken the Drury case down the IFF lane first, but that does not mean that there's any slowing up on work on the other growth areas, as Fiona's already mentioned, with respect to the Northwest and our ongoing work with both Kaingoa and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development on the Auckland Housing Programme.
Okay, Chair, so it's going to be critical that we don't lose sight of those other areas. So I'm just wondering how that motion needs to read then. I think we do need to acknowledge in that motion that we are progressing with we're adopting the recommended approach, which is Drury as a priority, and I'll leave up the words to you and Peter and others.
Think, yeah, okay.
But to word it in such a way that it's not concluding at Drury.
Yeah.
So we've used the word pilot. I don't know if that helps there, and that there are other opportunities that we'll continue to look at.
I'll just wait and I'll send you a note. All right?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Meg Off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I took it from your earlier comment. We can make a comment as well as ask a question. I'm going to combine the two with your permission. I support the recommendation because it says that we need to keep exploring the IFF Act, and we clearly have to do that. What worries me is para 33, because that seems to run contrary to the decisions we've just made in the long-term plan. In the long-term plan, we set our debt limits. We said we made a choice not to put a strategic asset sale into it, and we made a decision that we weren't going to increase rates beyond what we have set out. And 33, as I read it, looks a bit like a Trojan horse that's throwing all those issues back on the table. And you want to put those on the table, you do it through an annual plan or you do it through a long-term plan. You don't feed it in through the back door. So I don't know whether I want to... I've registered what I believe about that. I think that's probably where the majority, well, it was with the majority view because we just supported a long-term plan. So we don't support a long-term plan and then put in another paper that maybe we'll increase the rates a bit more, or maybe we'll sell the strategic assets, or maybe we'll borrow more than we were going to. If you want to raise those issues, please raise them in the appropriate place, which is not this paper. So that's my statement. I'm pretty clear on it. I'll get Peter to comment on it. Maybe before I ask my questions, you'd like to comment on that, Peter?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. With the paper, as part of the balance sheet optimisation, it has focused on the IFF. Within the IFF, those are, as we've described them, potential options over a bigger time frame, and potentially include those other aspects. But as you've quite rightly pointed out, the recovery budget has already determined that those items that are in there have already been determined within the recovery budget. So within the frame of the pilot, they're not aspects for consideration. What they set is the frame within which we will be looking at the IFF.
Thank you. I think that's important to have on record here in case at some future time. So, but will you pass this paper saying we needed to look at that? Obviously, there's nothing to stop anyone looking at that in the future, but it needs to be done in the appropriate context, and obviously it would have to be consulted on, so it's not appropriate to take it further on this paper. My questions are a bit more straightforward. I've looked at section 55 on the pilot, but I'm not sure yet when you estimate we might be able to commence the pilot in Drury. Could I maybe get some clarification from one of our officers at the front table? I don't know whether it's which one of you want to answer that one.
Through the chair, that's the January to March. We're hoping to have the investigations concluded to come back to you with the paper. Obviously, we then need to get your input before we can actually finalise the way that we might do an application for an IFF policy, because what Crown wants through the exercise that we're doing and maybe what the councillors want us and the way you want us to apply might be very different. So we're hoping that it will be January to March if all the policies, processes, applications and everything's agreed is in place.
Thank you. I mean, a brief comment on that is I think it's essential that we do it in this. I'm listening to what Councillor Darby is saying, but we know from the work that you've already done that brownfields is more complex. We haven't actually had any pilot for the IFF yet, so let's start with an area that doesn't quite have the same complexities that we've got in the brownfields area. It doesn't mean to say we can't move to the brownfields later on. The second thing, and this would have to be very high level, but if we brought in an IFF that looked at an IFF charge of probably $1,000 to $1,500 a year, which I think was the range that you were looking at, can you give us a high-level estimate of, I know there's lots of qualifications needed on it, but how much money you might be able to raise through that revenue source backing a higher borrowing capacity? What sort of dollars are we potentially looking at?
So the historical ways that we looked at that, it was hundreds of millions, and depends on who you actually charge and what you actually charge them. And there's some national and local political decision making to be made there before we can determine that.
Okay, so we're talking about big sums of money here that if we didn't have an IFF, we wouldn't be able to go further. My last question is on, and somebody else has raised the question of the plan changes, but my understanding that any consideration of the plan change, which we are currently opposing, would need to be premised on developers coming to the party with something really significant that might make this affordable and attractive. Is that still the position that we're negotiating on?
Correct. We still have the RMA and the developer mitigation that they need to pay as part of the growth, their contribution to growth, and that will be taken into consideration in the holistic figures. There's multiple parties, developers, landowners, the beneficiaries, Crown in their multiple entities in the infrastructure that they deliver and the infrastructure that we deliver.
Sorry, Your Worship, I was just trying to help Councillor Darby amend this resolution. No more questions? Oh, Councillor Newman, sorry.
Chair, would it be fair to say, though, that although it's taken into account, that's what the answer that's just been provided to the Mayor, that in reality that never happens, does it? Because always there is a debate around what the developers are prepared to say to the commissioners in terms of their contribution to offset the cost of growth, and the shortfall between what they say and what's required and what they deliver. That's just on the capital side. And they never talk about the operating costs that they will never fund, do they? So would it be fair to say that the model that you're talking about here is a model that's is a funding cost that is passed on to the end property owner in the way of an annual fee, but the actual front-end capital cost, this isn't it, is it? It's not, ultimately this is not going to cover all of those big transmission costs, transmission infrastructure costs that are going to be required at Drury or anywhere else.
So it's fair to say that the levy is similar to a targeted rate. And the reason we need to go through this exercise is there are multiple ways that we could apply it because the legislation is so broad-ranging. That's why we pull together the people in the room to get a little bit more guidance and bring it down, and that's why we'll need to come back to you with regards to what your advice will be.
Would this targeted IFF rate cover the capital cost up front? Fund the debt required to fund the initial capital outlay for the infrastructure? Or would it fund that cost plus the depreciation of the infrastructure subsequent to it becoming live?
So the legislation only provides for it to cover capital costs, so similar to DCs.
And so the depreciation of this new infrastructure for the stuff that goes out of sequence is then to be socialised for everybody to pay for as part of our consolidated costs on the balance sheet.
Yes, that would be funded through our standard revenue sources, rates, fees and charges.
So just thinking back to the questions that Chris Darby asked before, it would be reasonable to surmise that the success of this particular model is the ability of it to ensure a stream of revenue and profit for the developers who privatise that, but the cost of it will then be passed on to the end property purchaser, and the depreciation costs will be passed on to everyone else.
Yes, and I think that's partly an answer to Councillor Hill's question earlier about when we bring options back to you, they will include timing and the ongoing operating costs, and to your point, to the how those ongoing operating costs will be funded, and before any decisions are made.
And thinking about the largest developer of all, which is the Crown, we're not even including them in this model because they're mainly in the brownfields, but we're not touching at this point because we're going to Drury first, which is the greenfields.
So our work with the Crown and the Auckland Housing Program, we haven't begun looking at the IFF models as yet, but we do continue to work with them in thinking about both capital and operating costs.
Okay, any further questions? Well, I have a mover from Councillor Cashmore and a seconder by Councillor Darby. I'll open now for comments. Councillor Mulholland.
Happy with the recommendation, but I'm not going to, like it noted, that I will vote against 33. Opposition to it, thanks.
Okay. Councillor Walker.
Really just to reinforce the need to have a number of case studies other than Drury. I mean, Drury's massive. It's got all sorts of problems attached to it. There may be other smaller areas such as I'm suggesting that could be successful examples. And I also endorse Councillor Darby's suggestion around brownfield areas. We need to start getting traction around that and traction around Kaingora. So we should be working on multiple fronts.
That's why the recommendations have been amended slightly. Thank you. Any other comments?
Just one, Madam Chair. I just do have a concern that this is going to drive up cost of housing for low socioeconomic people and Māori being marginalised more outside of the CBD. So I do want to register a concern around how that might be alleviated through the Act or through our approach here in these developments. I think it's a real concern that's going to be expressed by the marginalised communities.
Thank you. Comment, Councillor Darby?
That is a really important point to address. And I think that will be reflected in this work. I'm expecting it to be reflected. It's probably just a little reminder that to date, the funding has been from primarily rates or taxation sources. So the good people of Rodney, the North Shore or the West have been paying to underwrite or subsidise at tremendous levels, and we're calling that in. We're saying that we can't actually allow that level of subsidisation to occur, that the beneficiary needs to foot the bill. There will be some spread as well, because there will be some sub-regional and regional benefits, and that will be calculated. But I think fundamental to this is that the beneficiary is going to have to pay greater, and that may be reflected in house prices, but it was always reflected in house prices somehow, because another part of our organisation or government has been heavily subsidising particularly greenfield growth, but not exclusively greenfield growth, but particularly greenfield growth has been heavily subsidised to date by the good old ratepayers of Auckland and the good old taxpayers of New Zealand.
So does this localise the cost to a suburb where they traditionally lived in, those people that lived in those outlying areas? Is that correct?
Shouldn't have done that, but yes. Okay, any more comments? Right, it's got a mover and a seconder. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against?
Aye.
Carried. Thank you. And I've noted them. Minutes, just a couple of minutes, give you a bit of a break, stand up, and I hope to do the remaining of the open agenda before lunch, all things being equal. I just thought I would share that with you. Thank you.